Hi, and welcome to my tutorials on chess basics. In our first tutorial, we covered where to place the chess pieces on the chessboard and how the chessboard itself is to be placed. In our next tutorials, we will start to look at how the chess pieces move and capture, and we will start with the pawn. Now, pawns can be used for defense, attack, protecting each other and your officers, chase your opponent's pieces off squares of interest, and let's not forget capturing your opponent's pieces. You name it, and even though pawns are the weakest piece you have, they are a very essential part of chess, and in real gameplay, having just one more pawn than your opponent can decide the game in your favor. Okay, let's get back to how the pawn moves. Here we have an example position. White has 3 pawns on the right side of the board, which we in chess terms call the king side, and black has 3 pawns on the left side of the board, which in chess terms we call the queen side. The pawn moves forwards. It cannot move sideways, and it cannot move backwards. It can only move forwards. And the same goes for black's pawns. They can only move forwards. So when you move a pawn, you have to keep this in mind. And as long as there is no obstacles or possible captures in its path, it will follow a straight line. Now, the very first time you move a pawn, you have an option of moving it 1 or 2 squares forward. And this is true when it comes to all pawns. Not just the pawn you already moved, but any pawn. After its initial move, it can only move 1 square at a time. And just to make my point clear, if you decide to move your pawn 1 square the first time you move it, then you can't move it 2 squares at a later time. The option of moving it 2 squares only applies to the very first time you move it. Here you can see that both white and black are using their option to move the pawn 2 squares forward. They could just as well move a pawn 1 square forward. Now, as we just mentioned, when a pawn is moved for the very first time, it can only move forwards 1 square at a time. Here we have a new example. If there is a piece in front of your pawn, it simply cannot move. It doesn't matter if it is your piece or an opponent's piece, it just can't move. Something is blocking its path, and in our case, it's a black pawn that is blocking the path of our D pawn. And the same goes for our F pawn. Right now, the black pawn here on F5 is blocking the path of our F4 pawn, and right now the only pieces on the board that can move is our king and pawn here on E2, and the opponent's pawn on E7 and his king. Here I've made a new example. I have thrown in a few knights here, but right now we don't have to concern ourselves with the knights. What I want you to do, from white's perspective, find out which of his pawns can move and how far. You can stop the video if you want to. The white pawn on A3 cannot move, and the reason for it is his own piece. The white knight is blocking its path. The white pawn on B2 can move. It has the option to move 1 or 2 squares forward, and the reason for it is it has not moved yet. White's D pawn can move 1 square ahead. The black pawn here is not blocking its path yet, and it can move only 1 square because it has already moved. And white's F pawn here on F5 cannot move because the black pawn on F6 is standing in its way. We have discussed how the pawn moves, and we have also discussed when the pawn cannot move. What we haven't discussed is how the pawn captures, and we'll take a look at that now. What we do know is that the pawn cannot move sideways, and it cannot move backwards. It can only move forwards. But when a pawn captures, it captures diagonally forwards. So right now, this white pawn can take the black pawn on d5, and it also has the option of capturing the black pawn on f5. And these are just possibilities. If it wanted to, it could still just move forwards. Let's try to make a capture and see what happens. If white captures black's pawn here on f5, we have to remember that black can also capture diagonally, which means black can capture our pawn. If we instead capture black's pawn on d5, we can remember something very important. If we can capture diagonally, we can also protect diagonally. So if black's king here wanted to capture our pawn on d5, we can move our c pawn here on c2, 2 squares forwards, and right now we will be protecting this pawn on d5. Here is our last example. Take a look at white's pawns and find out everything you can about them. Can they move? If not, why? Can they capture? If you want to, stop the video and have a look. White's a pawn can move 1 square forwards. White's b pawn cannot move forwards because in front of it we have the black pawn here on b5. What it can do is capture black's c pawn on c5. Now we know that a pawn goes forwards in a straight line, and if it did capture the c pawn here, it would continue on the c file. White's d pawn has the option of moving 1 square or 2 squares forward. I can just mention that if it did move 2 squares forward, black has the possibility with either his pawn on c5 or e5 to capture it diagonally forwards from black's perspective. White's e pawn cannot move. It is blocked by his own piece, the white knight here on e3, and the g pawn can move 2 squares forwards or 1, depending on what you yourself want. And white's h pawn can only move 1 square forward, and the reason is it has already moved. That concludes my tutorial on how the pawn moves and captures. And in my next tutorial I'll take a look at how the rook moves and captures. I'm quite aware that I might be over-explaining a few things here, but that's just the way I do it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time.